nutrition, so we come to it from both angles, I guess. He's going to answer the difficult questions.
I'm going to try.
And I'm talking about really the assessment methodology underlying the SQE and other national licensing exams. So really the agenda, and do ask questions if you want to. The agenda that we're going to go through today is I'm going to say something about the sort of fundamental concepts that underlie national licensing exams, the medical exams in the UK, the bar exams in the States, and now actually the UK bar central assessment. So I'm going to say something about those fundamental psychometric principles. I'm then going to say a little bit about marking and competency-based exams, and finally something about how we set the pass mark for the SQE. So starting off with the fundamental psychometric principles, I mean, really the most basic principle isn't up there, which is that you have to be absolutely sure that those that pass deserve to pass and those that fail deserve to fail. And it has to be done with a degree of accuracy that you can defend. So to provide the underlying concepts to that are that to provide a technically competent exam which tests people appropriately and fairly, you need reliability, precision, and validity. And I'm just going to talk through each of those concepts. So reliability is essentially a numerical concept, and it's to do with, or it could be measured statistically, and it's to do with consistency and predictive utility. So the question it's answering is, does the test rank order candidates in a way that would be replicated in another exam? And it's measured by something called the alpha coefficient, which I will explain later. The reason that's important is clearly if candidates sat one exam and it rank ordered them in one order, and then they sat another similar exam and it was completely different order, that really isn't a very good basis for granting a license to practice. Precision is about the accuracy of the measurement of their not their grade, their actual numerical mark. And it's measured by something called the standard error of measurement, which is again a statistical concept, which we'll talk some more about. And validity is a sort of a unifying framework as to what makes a good test. So testing the right things, testing them in appropriate ways, and it also incorporates ideas about reliability and precision. So why are we making all this fuss about all these things? The sort of bottom line is that I was lucky my questions came up. You have to try to eliminate as much as possible in a national licensing exam. So it should have no place in a high-stakes professional exam. So whether or not candidates qualify should be based on an assessment of appropriate competencies and knowledge which would be replicated if they took a similar exam, which reaches a very high standard of accuracy. And, the reasons, responsibility to the consumer, responsibility to the profession, responsibility to candidates, and obviously the exam must be defensible in the courts. So, first of all, saying a bit more about reliability and how it's measured. So as I said, it's about, does the test rank order candidates in a way that would be replicated in another exam? So ideally, you would measure that by getting them all to sit another exam. Clearly, they're not going to be very happy about doing that. So the alternative, the most basic alternative that is used is to divide any test into two halves, as many ways as you can, and look at the correlation between the marks on the two halves. And that sort of predicts whether you'll be able to set another exam where the two halves, the mark on the two halves correlates. So the result of dividing the tests into all the possible halves is a statistic called the alpha coefficient, and it ranges from 0 to 1. So if it's 1, that means your exam is perfectly reliable and it's not actually achievable. If it's 0, then really you've been marking the papers totally at random and you may as well throw them down the stairs. So high-stakes professional exams have quite demanding targets as to what that reliability statistic should be, and it's often said that it should be 0.8 for a skills exam and 0.9 for a multiple choice exam. So the question then is what that means for exam design if we're so concerned about reliability. And really the fundamental notion is that if you ask one question on contract, you will have very little idea of whether a candidate will get the next question right. If you ask more questions, clearly you're going to have a better idea. So longer tests are going to be more reliable than shorter tests. But that doesn't mean you can have a test of infinite length. Obviously, exam design is a compromise, and a longer exam is more expensive, and you have to get a balance between the two. So just to illustrate that with the statistics from the Stage 1 SQE pilot. So along the bottom is the number of MCQ items. And along the other axis is the alpha coefficient. And that red line shows how it increases when you've got more questions going towards your pass-fail point. And as we said, the best practice target is that you get 0.9. And as you can see, at 180 questions, you're going to achieve 0.9. So that is why we recommended that the design should be 2 exams of 180 questions. What that means in practice is that if people sit another exam, they will get a very similar result. Another exam of 180 different questions, but an exam designed in the same way. Has anybody got any questions? Yeah.
Sorry, Tracy Savage from Barbary. I was just wondering in relation to the 180 questions produces the 0.9, but the 180 questions aren't all on the same subject.
No.
So going back to your point, if you ask only one question on contract,
yes.
So in that 180 questions, if you only had 2 questions on solicitors' accounts, for example, how does that
Okay, so
replicate?
the reliability of the subsections is going to be lower than the reliability of the whole. So again, it's a compromise. We did do a lot of work on looking in the pilot at whether people were compensating, you know, how low they were getting marks in some areas and still getting a high mark overall. Overall, it's quite rare that that happens. But again, it's a compromise. To get a sufficiently reliable exam in, say, just contract, you don't want to be asking 180 questions on contract, or whatever it would be. It would probably be slightly less, but it would still be an awful lot. So the subsections are less reliable than the whole, but the pass-fail point is, above all, what you have to make reliable.
If the subsets are less reliable, what's the reliability of the ethics testing?
The ethics is pervasive throughout all the bits. I couldn't tell you offhand what the reliability of the ethics bit would be. It's not going to be 0.9, I can tell you that. But again, it's a compromise. You could, well, an exam just on ethics clearly doesn't make much sense because you've got to put it within the other things.
No, one of the things the public expect is...
Indeed.
They don't necessarily expect you know X level of knowledge about each subject area, but they do expect you to have ethics.
Yeah. I mean, and just from a statistical point of view, you probably wouldn't do that kind of analysis because there's no reproducibility of an ethics section within an exam that has a compensation in it anyway. So, and again, I think at that point you look at the composite between that and the other areas within the test to produce an overall high reliability that you can see here rather than those individual sections. But I think logically it wouldn't make much sense to me to calculate a reliability if that wasn't likely to be the thing that you're trying to reproduce.
How do you know that, sorry, if a member of the public said, how do you know that this day one solicitor is ethical, could you answer that question? Would you be looking to SQE 1 or 2, or would you just...
Well, be looking to all of it, because ethics questions would also be in SQE 2. We looked at the compensation between different subjects. The ethics questions are sort of embedded in the subjects, so we didn't look at ethics questions separately.
Can I just add to that? As Eileen said at the start, in assessment design you're always going to compromise between the size of the test and other issues like feasibility, cost and so on. So you could certainly have 180 questions for all of the core areas of practice that we license people to practice in. So for litigation, for business, etc., etc. You could have 180 questions for all of that. You could have 180 questions for ethics too. That would result in an assessment which was significantly more onerous for candidates and significantly more expensive. And we have to achieve a balance around all of those competing considerations. What we have is we have an assessment design where ethics is embedded across everything. That's a significant enhancement of where we are at the moment, where ethics is not required to be taught on the qualifying law degree at all. So it's a significant step up and a significant commitment in terms of the pervasive nature of the ethical assessment.
You can set minimum thresholds for any area within the overall composite pass-fail point. When we did the analysis from the pilot, it wasn't necessary to do so in the sense that it was the thing that people who are good and people who aren't so good. There was some compensation between subjects, but one can set minimum thresholds, but because it's very unreliable, this is getting a bit technical, but because the measurement of that is unreliable, the minimum threshold would be quite low. But you can set minimum thresholds and we can monitor whether minimum thresholds are needed. Okay, I'll go on then to accuracy. I'm just looking at the time. Or precision. So that's the other sort of basic concept, I guess, in national licensing exams. And it's based on the idea that all measurement has some error. So there's a difference between a candidate's actual score and their true score. We can never sort of know their true score, but we can measure how big the size of the error is round it. And we can estimate it statistically with something called the standard error of measurement. So a mark, say a 51%, could be very precise. So you know with a high degree of accuracy, for instance, that the real mark is between 50 and 52%, or it could be quite inaccurate. So you know that the real mark is probably between, I think this is 46 and 56%. And the standard error of measurement is calculated from test length, test reliability, spread of candidate scores. But the basic point is that the lower the standard error of measurement, the higher the quality of the exam. Clearly, you want your exam to give as accurate a mark to candidates as possible. And again, we can illustrate it from the pilot and the pilot MCT, where you can see that the standard error of measurement decreases as the test length increases. So again, this is going up to 180 items along the bottom. On the other axis, we've got the standard error of measurement. I mean, the standard error of measurement of sort of 9% would be totally unacceptable. It means you don't know what their true score is within a very big range. At 180 questions, you've got a standard error of measurement of just over 3%, which is generally considered acceptable. So again, what it means for exam designs, again, longer tests are more precise than shorter tests, but again, exam design is a compromise, but the exam has to fulfill the very high quality statistics that are expected of a professional licensing exam. And then the last concept was validity, which is a sort of all-encompassing framework. And I won't go into that too much in view of the time, but it covers all aspects of the exam, from content, marking, it covers reliability and precision, consequences of the assessment outcome, etc. So those were the basic concepts, the basic 3 concepts that we would say that a high-quality professional licensing exam has to be concerned about. Has anybody got any questions before I go on to the next bit? Yeah.
I just wondered, I know previously you've changed from having 3 papers to 2 papers with the 180 questions, but because of the length of time of a 180 paper, and you have previously said that you'll incorporate a break into these papers.
Yes.
So are the stats affected by a break in an exam paper?
I don't think they would be to any significant degree at all, no.
You don't think they would be, but I'm curious, because all of that blows my mind a little bit anyway, but I'm just curious how you know that and whether you're testing that, because obviously you didn't pilot.
I mean, certainly in QLTS we have a break, we have the 2 halves, we've looked at the correlation between the 2 halves, there's no discrepancy, the questions are sort of randomised across the 2 halves, so obviously, but there isn't any discrepancy.
Eileen, it's Lucy Reid from Oxford University Press. I just had a question about the sort of measurements that you're saying. You're saying that 0.9 is an acceptable measure for the alpha coefficient, and
for
just
an MCT, yes.
Yes, and for just over 3% for the standard error of measurement. How did you decide that those were the appropriate measurements, or are they this?
No,
standard
I mean, they are
acceptable
internationally recognised,
right.
Certainly in the States, in medical exams in the UK, by the Royal Colleges. So no, I did not make them up.
Yeah, they're very much rules of thumb that are pervasive around healthcare assessment. I have no idea where they originated from, but they seem to be where the standards are that others doing similar things achieve, and certainly that 0.9 value is widely used around Royal Colleges on postgraduate exams, and same sort of thing, high stakes, 1 chance to do it right, so you would be expecting that kind of a level.
Yeah, also the multi-state bar exam. Yeah, okay, sorry, yeah.
Thank you. Fiona Farger from Liverpool John Moores. Question about minimum thresholds, because it's something that we've discussed
Minimum thresholds.
for individual subjects. Because it's something we've discussed, and we're quite worried that to us it looks as if you do well in 2 out of 3 areas, that you can actually pass this exam without passing a particular subject. And when you look at the thresholds for the qualifying law degree, the subjects that people have to pass, and they have to pass on the 3rd attempt, and there's no compensation, and there are specific subjects you have to pass every single one of them. If we do not have minimum thresholds for individual subjects in the SQE, surely that's a drop in standards, isn't it? Surely that's moving backwards.
We have looked at the actual figures from the pilot, and we've looked at compensation, and that is not happening. So we looked at we actually looked at where the cut-off would be if we had minimum thresholds, and it caught almost no one. But it is something that can be monitored and on an ongoing basis. If it becomes necessary to have minimum thresholds, then that may well be way forward, but it isn't something that,
Sorry, if I could just say that's one pilot and we all know how much use one pilot is.
right.
Could we have an assurance that that is going to be monitored?
I mean, we would monitor it, I'm sure. I mean, in QLTS, we monitor all the time the skills marks against the law marks and whether anybody can pass with a very low law mark.
No, I think the challenge is that for every single subject that we need to have that minimum threshold in, we'd have to have 180 questions on. So if you're looking at creating a minimum at a reliable level to pass or fail someone on, that would be, so it sort of multiplies the length of the exam somewhat.
I can see that you're still not satisfied. I think we need to move on and perhaps we can
Okay. Sorry, I'm taking too long. So just quickly, I'll say something about marking. So what I was going to say about marking was relatively short. So I have an exercise for everybody to do. So if you can remember how to do long multiplication. So the task is multiply 269 by 63. And the answer the student's given is on the right-hand side. And just individually, just give it a mark out of 10. If you can remember how to do multiplication. You can use your phones. Any volunteers for a mark out of 10? If you were the teacher, you know, or whatever, marking it. They can't do the sum, that's the problem. You can use your phone. Any volunteers for a mark out of 10? 0, okay, so we've got a 0. Any other volunteers for a mark out of 10?
As a maths teacher, 0. As a law teacher, maybe 8 or 9.
Okay. Any others? Any other volunteers for how you would mark this? If you were... Yeah, Jason.
The first line is right.
Okay, 5. Okay, so we've got between 0, 5 and 9, which I think illustrates the problem. So for those of you that didn't have your phones, there's the method is right, there's one digit wrong. It's issues about marking. So it's just some of the issues this raises, and then I'm going to say a little bit about the SQE approach to marking skills. So obviously, you know, are you marking the result or are you marking how they calculated it? Fundamental point. So you get the thing, you know, the small mistake that can result in a negligence claim, how do you mark that? Or the large mistake that they get away with because of the fact pattern. So that's, in a way, similar to this. Looking at the detail or looking at the whole, which actually, the sort of opposite of the example would be if the answer was right, but the method was wrong, if you see what I mean. I think that's looking at the detail or looking at the whole. So there are all these considerations in marking. The way that the SQE skills will be marked is examiners exercising professional judgment, but using referring to the description of competency and ensuring they have adequate training, preparation and supervision. So it's about a sort of approach that is about marking, do they know the basic principles, not about the detail. So competency-based marking of legal skills assessments in the SQE, markings based on the professional judgment of examiners informed by competency and as defined by the statement of competence and the functioning legal knowledge. So typically you'd have grading like this, and it relates all the marks to the competency requirement. So So the connections maintained between the marking and the purpose of the assessment. So it's a very different sort of approach to marking than sort of 1 mark for this and 1 mark for this. It's a sort of, it's global professional judgments, an overview of understanding and so on. Okay, that's all I was going to say about marking. The last bit, because I will go on and then maybe questions, is about how we set the pass mark. Some cut scores and pass marks. So, what should the pass mark for the SQE be? So, the traditional approach perhaps is to choose a mark. And we asked the candidates in the SQE1 pilot, this is the MCT bit, what they thought the pass mark should be. And you'll see, and those are the answers. So you'll see it varies between 40% and 80%. It was anonymous, so we don't know how it correlated with how they did. So why we can't use that traditional approach? The first question clearly, which that sort of raises, is what mark should we choose and how can we justify it? So, 40%, 50%, 60%. But even if we could choose a mark, what it doesn't deal with then is that the exam might be more difficult or easier than previous exams. And obviously that's probably not going to be a huge amount, if the question setters and so on, but you can't say that 2 questions are the same difficulty ever. So again, it's the sort of exactness that's required because of the purpose of the exam. So instead of starting from a mark, we start from a description of the just passing candidate. So a description of competency, and we apply it to the exam. So, and we apply, and a range of examiners apply it to the exam. So the pass marks are based on the professional judgment of the examiners about the application of the level descriptor to that particular assessment. So it's not a fixed pass mark and it's not a fixed pass rate. Pass mark is just related to the difficulty of the exam, not to the cohort. And it results in a justifiable pass mark which adjusts to the difficulty of the exam and maintains standards between cohorts, even if their ability is different. Yeah.
At the corresponding event last year, there was an indication from one of your colleagues that if, as one might expect over a period of time, we get better at preparing candidates for the exams, then you will raise the pass mark to compensate for that.
I can't comment on you saying someone said that last year.
Well,
but the standard of competency is the standard of competency, and it doesn't vary with the cohort or how well prepared they are.
Thank you.
James Catchpole, City Law School. Sorry, I'm being a little bit dim or ignorant here. Can you just explain the methodology a little bit more?
I'm going to go on to the methodology as to how it works.
If I could just pose my question, and if you're going to answer it, then please do. You're talking 180 questions, of which there's going to be a right answer. Some questions may be harder than others. And then you can possibly then benchmark what the average good candidate should get. If you're talking about the different difficulties that different ability cohorts are going to have, is that a question of lowering the standard for that cohort or raising it?
No, I said the pass mark stays the same irrespective of the standard of the cohort. I think I am going to go on to answer you, to explain how it works in detail. So, how is the level descriptor applied to the exams? For the MCT, it's hang-off, and I'll go into how that works. It's the basic mechanism. For skills, it's borderline regression. And then I'm going to say a little bit about how we deal with test unreliability and using more than one method. So to go off, this is, I hope, exactly what you're thinking about. For the MCT, you have a standard setting group of, say, 10 to 16 solicitors. They should be, they're all qualified solicitors. You should include some who are newly qualified, therefore have a good idea of the standard of qualification, not people with unrealistic expectations. So it's not about, it's about competency. So the way it would work is that, first of all, this group would discuss the standard of competency and the characteristics of a candidate who would just pass. And then you go through every single question on the paper, and each panel member assesses the likely performance of 10 just passing candidates on each question. So how many would get it right? Average it all out, add them all together. I'll show you in a minute. And then that is essentially your first indication of the pass mark for that paper. So that is a completed spreadsheet for 10 questions with 15 judges. 10 questions down the left, the judges across the top. The mark in red is the average. So they've all given different numbers out of 10 that they think would get, of just passing candidates who would get that question right. That's been averaged and then added up. And so for these 10 questions, the first indication is that the pass mark is 50.9. You don't just do that, as it says there. I think question 9, for instance, question 9, there's a pretty big range of marks, of numbers of candidates, that just passing candidates that they think would get it right. So you would normally then have a discussion if there's such a big range. You might ask people if they want to change their minds, but they don't have to. And you go through every single question on the paper that way. That is a sort of internationally recognized way of setting the standard for an MCT. Does that answer your question?
I think so. Can you just explain, say you've got your question 7 there, where you go from a range of 1 to 6.
Yeah.
Sorry, your question 7, where you've got a range of 1 to 6,
yes.
and it is varying there.
Yes.
What then? You've got your standard deviation. You're saying 1.53. What does that mean? And then your 2.9.
Okay, so the standard deviation is a measure of the spread of marks. The 2.9. Are we on? No. On which question? Sorry,
question 7.
Question 7. Yeah. The 2.9 is the average of all those. The 5 and the 5 and the 6 and the whole line.
So how would it then work? I go and sit that paper. I get those 10 questions. What is my expected pass mark to achieve on that paper? Is it the 50.9 in red?
Correct.
And that would then, if you had a further different 10 questions, it could go up or down.
Yeah.
From that
So if you'd add the whole lot up, I mean, yeah.
So you're not actually setting a bar that we expect the profession to enter in at, say, 60%. No. You're going to do it against the mean, against each of those questions as they comprise that paper.
It's setting the pass mark by reference to the statement of competency.
Okay, I'll let that question carry on for a little while because it's quite important to just make sure people understood that. I've got the advantage of you in that I know how many slides Eileen still has to get through. So
it's not that many. Okay, right, okay.
Carries on, gets to the end, and there'll be opportunities later in the day if people still have questions to ask to raise those.
Okay, so I'm just going to say how we set the pass mark for skills stations. Clearly, you can't ask how many people out of 10 would get it right, because there isn't any getting it right. So this is about an exam, and I know, yes, people don't like the word stations, where there are a number of individual assessments making one exam. So every candidate that does an exercise will get marked on it against the assessment criteria. But the examiner will also give a global rating of whether it's a pass, marginal fail, or fail. And that global rating doesn't go to that candidate's marks, but it's used to calculate the pass mark. So it's a statistical calculation reviews all the candidate marks in the light of all the global judgments. And we were now going to illustrate it. So that's one candidate's mark on one station. And you can see they've got just over 40%, and they've been given, they think that's, the examiner thinks that's a marginal fail. And these standard setting judgments are again made relative to the statement of competency. That's all candidates on that one station. So you can see that obviously, fortunately, the marks go up. You know, the passes are higher than the marginal passes, but there is a range. So those are all those blue dots are candidates and their mark on the station, and then placed against their standard setting grade. Then what you do mathematically is insert a line of best fit. So you find the best fit between all those marks and the standard setting grades. And where that crosses the borderline is the cut score for that station. I'm not sure if anybody followed that. Yeah. It's quite complicated.
Hi, thank you. John Coop from South Bank. It's complicated. It's obviously very new to many of us, I'm sure. But I'm thinking from the point of view of a candidate, what will a candidate see in terms of scores, raw scores, and explanation? Is there a risk they're going to be extremely confused about what their results mean?
No, the candidate will be given their marks as normal, and there'll be a pass mark.
And remember that all A-level and GCSE students go through the same process, because grade boundaries on those exams also move. So
so they get given their marks on their full marks, and they get given the pass mark, so they know whether they've passed or failed. That's just the same as. They don't need to be told about the standard setting grade. That's a mathematical...
No, that standard setting grade is for me, so I can set the standard, but they won't get it back. So actually, if someone gets a marginal pass during an assessment by the examiner, the candidate won't ever see that. They will get their final score and a pass-fail outcome overall.
That's because the marginal pass doesn't relate to that candidate. It relates to setting the pass mark.
Could a candidate re-sitting get a higher mark at raw score and still see that they failed? That's possible because of the standard difference.
Yes, I mean, the stations shouldn't be wildly different in terms of their difficulty, but they will fluctuate a bit, and especially skills stations. The pass mark will vary between different sittings, as will the pass rate.
what I'd just say is these slides will be available, so you will have the opportunity to pore over them and get into but there's a new approach to
I've only got a couple more slides. So you've got the cut score on one station. But you've got a number of stations making the exam, so you add them all up and divide them by average them to get the cut score for the whole exam. So you wouldn't normally get a pass mark for a station. You get a pass mark for the whole exam. It's just a building block towards the pass mark for the whole exam. There's just one more element to add on. So we've said that you can use the ANGOF, the MCT, and you can use borderline regression for skills stations, but we haven't taken any account of the standard error of measurement of that accuracy of that mark. The normal procedure in high-stakes professional exams is to prioritise the interests of the consumer, and therefore you add on some amount of standard error of measurement to the cut score to arrive at the pass mark. so that you're completely sure that those who pass deserve to pass. And the normal procedure certainly is as in the bar exams in the States and the medical exams in the UK, as I said, is to add on standard error of measurement. Only one more slide, that's it then. So those are the basic standard setting methods. Often, in fact, you would use more than one, and the exam board would look at them all in context and so triangulate to get a final pass mark. Because the final pass mark is at the discretion of the exam board, but obviously it has to use defensible mechanisms. And that's it.
We have run on. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.